Hi and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to talk to you about the 100-page rule. This is a rule I invented for my own reading of books, and I brought it in when I was facing this beast, George Eliot's Middlemarch. I sort of drew up a list of sort of major books that I'd never read, like Moby Dick and Vanity Fair and War and Peace. I'd never read all the way through, and I thought, I've got to start. So this was the first on the list. But I worried that I wasn't going to like it because I'd read George Eliot at university, I'd read Adam Bede, and God, I was bored. So I made myself a rule, and that was that I would read the first 100 pages, and if I wasn't enjoying it, I would put it down. Prior to that, I always read a book, always right through to the end. I couldn't leave it, even if I was hating it. But this was the book where I changed. And since then, I've instituted this law, and the law is, if the book is less than 200 pages, I will read it all, because that's nothing, right? If it's 200 pages or over, I read the first 100 pages, and then if I don't like it, leave it, right? Now, some people might say, 100 pages, that's quite a lot. Some people say, you know what, I know, Mike, within the first 2 chapters, sometimes even the first chapter if I like a book or not. I disagree. Exhibit A. This science fiction novel by Robert Silverberg called Downward to the Earth. By the way, the George Eliot did pass the 100-page mark, the 100-page rule, and it's one of my favourite books of all time. But this book was an interesting one because the first 2 or 3 chapters I thought were incredibly dull. It was very obviously a sci-fi reworking of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, one of my favourite novels. And what it is, it's set on this planet that the Earth discovered. And it's populated by intelligent elephants. And it was colonised by the Earth people. And then they decided to give it back its independence. And the main character is a guy who was part of that colonial force, like an ex-English colonial type, who goes back and he decides he's going to go and penetrate the jungle, which no man ever did, to find out the secret of the elephants. Right, this elephant species. And so the first few chapters, this guy arrives back on the planet, and it's pure Heart of Darkness, and you can see all the analogies and all the things that are equated, and it's very, very dull and obvious, and I thought, oh God, I'm going to hate this book. But then he starts on his journey into the jungle, and the world building by Silverberg is extraordinary. The use of language, the use of imagery, the sort of the tone of it is really frightening and disturbing. There's one extraordinary sequence where he comes across this colonial couple who've died in their house, and the local fauna, the local plant life has started to take over their bodies. It's brilliantly and horribly described. And it really takes you on a journey into darkness, you know. And so, though it starts really badly, the first 50 pages are really boring and obvious. It really builds. So I'm glad I stayed with it for 100 pages. Now, at the moment, I'm in the throes of a dilemma. I'm currently reading this book. I wonder if any of you have come across this book, Mythago Wood by Robert Holdstock. It was written in the 1980s and is considered in the UK as a kind of fantasy classic. The foreword to this book is written by Neil Gaiman, who's a great admirer of it. And I'm coming up to page 90, and I don't know whether to keep going with it or not. So if you know this book, is it worth reading on for the next 200 pages? I'm struggling with it. It's not that it's a bad book, right? It's quite well written. It's got an interesting conceit. So this guy returns home after the Second World War. It's set in the late 1940s. To his family estate. There's an upper middle class estate out in the country. And it's next to some woodland, right? And he discovers that his father and his brother have become obsessed with this woodland. They think there's something strange about it. And he comes to realise that this woodland has this ability. It can tap into the unconscious, and it can bring to life those kind of avatars of our ancient civilization, like Robin Hood and King Arthur, you know, and Merlin and Boadicea, and they come to life as spirits in the forest. So it's quite an interesting idea. And you know what? I think if I read this book when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I'd have bloody loved it. Now I find it all a bit obvious. And the main thing I don't like about the book is it's very well written. It's an interesting conceit, interesting characters, beautiful language. There's nothing wrong with it, right? It's just that I'm not thinking about it when I'm not reading it. And to me, that is the ultimate criterion for a great book. You know, are you thinking about it when you're not? Is it going through your head? Are you processing the story and the ideas and the themes? Do you want to get back to it? I don't feel that with this book. I read 10 pages, it's very enjoyable, it's interesting, it's got great imagery. I put it down, I don't think about it. Until the next time I read it, and it's quite nice, and then I put it down and I don't think about it. To me, that's a dead book. You know, it's just it doesn't matter how well written it is or how clever the ideas are. If it's not here when you're not reading it, to me it's a waste. And that's kind of how I feel about this book. I'm wondering if anyone out there knows this book. Does it get better? Will it get to me? Another sort of dead book that I had to leave after 100 pages, was a book called Ulverton by Adam Thorpe. I don't know if any of you have come across this. This was written in the early 90s and is regarded by some as a sort of recent English classic. And what it is, it's the life of one English village, Ulverton, from the end of the English Civil War in the 1600s up to the modern day. And it's told in a series of vignettes, right, involving different people at different stages of its history, written in different styles to suit that period of history, right? So sometimes it's written as a letter, sometimes it's written as a drama in the language of that period. And it's beautifully done. Clearly the writer did a lot of research, it's very evocative, it's very well written, and I just didn't care, right? It was a very good book of what it was doing, but to me it felt like a writer's exercise. It felt like this writer had set himself this little job, and he'd done it very effectively, but I kept asking myself, but what's the point? I know this about the history of English villages and English rural life. I grew up in a village. What are you actually achieving with this, rather than showing off your research and your flexibility with language? To me, it was a dead book. I've had this situation where I've left books behind. Ulverton was perhaps the most disappointing one because I'd had such, high hopes for that book. In the science fiction genre, I left this book behind, Ringworld by Larry Niven. God, reading the first 100 pages of this book was a chore. This is a popular book in science fiction. It led to a whole series set in Ringworld. Well, the first book by Larry Niven, who I don't think is a great writer, his prose leaves a lot to be desired. It takes 100 pages to get to bloody Ringworld, and by the time I got there I was thoroughly fed up because the characters were boring. They all felt sort of like a science fiction fan's wet dream of the people who populate a science fiction book, instead of really real three-dimensional characters who felt real with real lives. And frankly, I thought it was really tiresome. More controversially, I let go this book. Now, I might get hate for this, actually. This is generally regarded as one of the great science fiction novels, and I'm a huge fan of Ursula Le Guin, who wrote it. This is often considered to be her best book. I let it go after 100 pages. I was bored. I think there are two reasons. First of all, because it's not my kind of science fiction. It's fantastical science fiction, like Dune. It's like a sort of, instead of investigating science fiction concepts or science concepts, it really creates a whole world, a kind of medieval world, a kind of fantasy with its own rules and its own society. And then the whole story takes place in that. I don't find that very interesting. I like science fiction that relates to the world we live in. And secondly, what a lot of people admire about this book is its treatment of the subject of gender, which is very big these days, isn't it? And I have to be honest, that's not a subject that really interests me. What the book is about, it's set on a world of permanent winter, where the people on the world are hermaphrodites. So they're sort of sexless until they come to the time where they have sex and breed. And one of them will turn into a male, and one of them will turn into a female. And sort of most of the story and its themes hinge around that idea, which is a very interesting idea. I just don't think Ursula Le Guin explores it in a very interesting way. But I'm very much on my own with this. What else did I want to talk about here? Those are books that I left behind. Now I want to talk about books that I kept going with and I kind of regretted, actually. The first is a book called Hill of Dreams by one of my favourite supernatural writers, Arthur Machen. Hill of Dreams is unusual for Arthur Machen. He usually wrote short stories, like weird tales, like H.P. Lovecraft, where, some unsuspecting guy comes into contact with ancient gods, or the wine of the devil that turns him into a beast, or something like that. Hill of Dreams is kind of like a fictionalised autobiography. It's about a person who's very similar to Machen, a young adolescent man who has dreams of becoming a writer, who is obsessed with the history and the folklore of his world in southern Wales, in this town called Cillian. And he's obsessed with Roman history and pagan history, and he has a very vivid fascination with the occult, and he goes to London to become a writer. And this, of course, all mirrors Arthur Machen himself. So it's a kind of very vivid purple prose, fictionalised autobiography. And I read it because I liked Machen so much that I wanted to sort of see where he came from, as it were. So when it came to 100 pages, I was a bit undecided, but I thought, Machen's one of my favourite writers, I've got to keep going, right? So I kept going, and I kind of regretted it. This is the book where Machen kind of gorges himself on his own imagery and his own ideas. And it's a bit much, actually. It's a bit like a fine wine being brought out of a cellar, and then you have to drink 16 bottles of it in one go. Another writer I like very much, again from the world of fantasy, is Philip K. Dick. And so that was one of the reasons why I kept going with this book, Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. It had an interesting premise. It's set in futuristic Hollywood. And there's this guy, he's a presenter and an actor, and he's really famous. And he wakes up in a hotel one day, and no one knows who he is. His identity has been stolen from him. And no one purports to recognise him or know him or anything. And so he has to find out what's happened to him. Great premise. Unfortunately, Philip K. Dick investigates it with all those sort of hobby horses of 70s American sci-fi, psychoanalysis and drugs and all that stuff, which I find really boring. I stuck with it because it was a Philip K. Dick book, but I kind of wished I hadn't. If you know this book and you want to look at a better version of it, try Fools by Pat Cadigan from the early 90s, which is an absolutely fantastic science fiction novel. It's great fun. Another book that I kept going with, God knows why, was by a Canadian writer called Robertson Davies. In my early 20s, I read a book of his called Fifth Business, which blew my mind at the time. It had everything in it. It was this kind of grandiose epic story of this man's life, but it had sort of supernatural occult elements, comic elements. It went from the First World War through the 20s and 30s. I really enjoyed it. So then, I didn't know this. I picked up this book called Bred in the Bone, not realising that between Fifth Business and this book, I'd actually read a Robertson Davies book and totally forgotten about it, a book called The Rebel Angels. But then I read this book, Bred in the Bone, which is again this kind of epic saga about the people of this Canadian family, this logging family. And God, it bored me to tears. I kept going. It felt to me like a modern writer trying to ape sort of Dickens or the great, saga writers of the 1800s, with lots of, very sort of forced humour and forced grandiose structuring. And I found it really boring. And I wondered what it was in Robertson Davies that I first saw all those years ago in my 20s. If anyone else there has read Robertson Davies, let me know what you think and whether I'm on the wrong path here. I enjoyed Fifth Business, but Bred in the Bone, I could have left that at page 50. So that's my approach to reading books, the 100-page rule. Let me know below if you have anything similar. Do you read one chapter and then stop? Or can you not leave a book? Do you have to read every single page? Let me know. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe.